The forest had always been there, patient and ancient, its canopy filtering autumn light into long amber shafts that turned the undergrowth golden. On the morning of October 7th, 2003, it swallowed a boy whole. 16-year-old Daniel Kress left his family's cabin in the Cascade foothills at dawn, telling his younger sister through the screen door that he was heading to the ridge overlook to photograph the sunrise for a school project. He carried a disposable camera, a thermos of coffee his mother had prepared the night before, and a folded trail map his father had marked in red ink. The mist clung low between the Douglas firs, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. His sister watched him disappear down the gravel path, his green jacket bright against the grey morning, and then she went back to sleep. When the family woke 2 hours later and Daniel had not returned for breakfast, his father assumed he had lingered to catch better light. By noon, when his boots were still absent from the porch and his camera bag remained in his room, they called the ranger station. The search began that afternoon with a calm professionalism that would harden into urgency by nightfall. 6 rangers and a volunteer canine unit swept the marked trails radiating from the cabin, calling Daniel's name into corridors of trees that absorbed sound like a sponge. His scent led the dogs northeast along a secondary trail for nearly 3 miles before stopping abruptly at a rocky outcrop above a steep ravine. There was no blood, no torn fabric, no sign of a fall. The trail simply ended. By the 3rd day, helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the canopy, while ground teams expanded their grid into roadless wilderness. Daniel's parents, Margaret and Tom, stood at the command tent clutching photocopied flyers, their faces rigid with the kind of hope that requires physical effort to maintain. Investigators found his disposable camera wedged between 2 stones near the overlook, 11 exposures used, the rest blank. When developed, the photos showed nothing unusual. Sunrise breaking over ridgelines, a close-up of lichen on bark, the distant shimmer of a lake. The last frame captured a portion of his own boot and the edge of the trail slightly out of focus, as if he had been walking while shooting. The image haunted investigators because it suggested normalcy. A boy taking pictures on a morning hike, not someone about to vanish into wilderness without a trace. Weeks became months. The search transitioned from rescue to recovery, then to periodic sweeps triggered by anonymous tips that led nowhere. Margaret Kress stopped sleeping in their bedroom and began spending nights in Daniel's room, reading his journals, studying his sketches of trees and trails. She discovered he had been teaching himself orienteering, that he had checked out books on wilderness survival and edible plants from the school library. The details felt like clues, but they pointed in no clear direction. Tom threw himself into organizing search parties every weekend, recruiting hikers and climbers, mapping areas the official teams had deemed too remote or too dangerous. A year passed, then 2. The Kresses sold their house in Portland and moved permanently to a smaller cabin near the search zone, unable to leave the forest that had taken their son. Margaret trained as an EMT, learning trauma response and wilderness medicine. Tom learned tracking from a retired ranger, studying animal trails and how humans move through difficult terrain. They became fixtures in the local ranger community, respected and quietly pitied, the couple who could not move forward because they had never been allowed to move back. Their daughter Emily struggled differently. At 13, she had been the last person to see Daniel alive, and that final image of his green jacket disappearing into mist became a weight she carried into every room. She withdrew from friends, threw herself into academics, and developed an obsession with maps. Her bedroom walls became covered with topographic charts of the search area, pins marking every location her brother might have passed through. She traced possible routes with colored string until the maps looked like abstract art, beautiful and desperate. Her parents worried but understood. Grief had made cartographers of them all, trying to map a route back to the morning before loss. The first winter after Daniel's disappearance brought early snow that closed mountain roads and suspended search operations until spring. Margaret spent those months filing missing persons reports with agencies across 3 states, creating a database of unidentified remains and learning everything she could about cases of people who had vanished in wilderness and later been found alive. The statistics were grim. Most who survived more than 72 hours in backcountry without shelter did so through luck, not skill. Daniel had been prepared for a morning hike, not extended survival. Yet Margaret refused to accept the implicit conclusion. She had read his journals cover to cover, knew he had been studying wilderness skills, and believed that knowledge might have given him an edge. It was a thin hope, but it was the only hope available, and she clung to it with the tenacity of someone who understood that letting go meant accepting death. Tom approached the mystery differently. He became obsessed with the place where the dogs had lost Daniel's scent, returning to the rocky outcrop dozens of times in different weather conditions, trying to understand what had happened there. The ravine below was steep, but not insurmountable, dense with undergrowth and fallen timber. He climbed down into it repeatedly, searching for any sign his son had descended, but found nothing. Eventually, he concluded that Daniel must have changed direction at that point, possibly spooked by something or simply choosing a different route on impulse. But which direction, and why had trained search dogs found no trail? The questions multiplied faster than answers, each one opening onto a landscape of terrible possibility. In the spring of 2007, a pair of backpackers stumbled upon a small cave system 8 miles northeast of the original search perimeter, accessible only by scrambling down a scree field most hikers avoided. Inside the largest chamber, they found remnants of a makeshift camp, a sleeping platform of pine boughs layered with a torn emergency blanket, a circle of fire-blackened stones, and a plastic water bottle cut in half to serve as a bowl. On the cave wall, someone had scratched vertical tally marks in clusters of 5, covering nearly 6 feet of limestone. The backpackers counted 418 marks. Rangers secured the site and called in a forensics team. Among the debris, they recovered a rusted multi-tool engraved with the initials DK, fragments of a disposable lighter, and a small notebook with water-damaged pages. The handwriting was Daniel's. Margaret received the call on a Tuesday afternoon while restocking supplies at the ranger station. She drove to the cave site with Tom, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the steering wheel. When they entered the chamber and saw the tally marks, Margaret collapsed against the stone wall and wept. Her son had been alive. He had survived long enough to count days, to build shelter, to adapt. The relief was overwhelming and agonizing because it meant he had been out here, alone and suffering, while they searched in the wrong places. Tom examined the sleeping platform with the careful attention of someone who understood what survival cost. The pine boughs had been layered methodically for insulation. The fire circles showed evidence of multiple uses, stones arranged to reflect heat. Daniel had not simply endured. He had learned, adapted, persisted. The notebook entries were sparse, dated sporadically, and became increasingly terse as the pages progressed. The first readable entry, dated 3 weeks after his disappearance, described an injured ankle and a decision to shelter rather than risk descending in darkness. He had written, "Tried to find trail back, but everything looks the same. Ankle swollen, can't put weight on it. Found this cave, will wait for search helicopters. Saw one yesterday but too far south. They're looking in the wrong area." Subsequent entries mentioned rationing food, scavenged from the forest, filtering water from a seep at the back of the cave, and waiting for search helicopters that never came close enough. He had tried to create signal fires, but the cave's location in a narrow ravine made smoke difficult to see from above. He documented his attempts to treat his ankle using splints fashioned from branches and torn strips of his shirt. He wrote about hearing voices in the forest that turned out to be wind through the trees, about the psychological toll of isolation, about the creeping fear that no one was looking anymore. The entries spanned approximately 14 months, based on the dates he had been able to track. Some pages were illegible, damaged by moisture or torn. Others contained sketches, crude maps of the surrounding terrain, drawings of edible plants he had identified, diagrams of snare designs. The final legible entry, dated but with the month uncertain, read, "Ankle healed enough, food sources running low, cave flooded twice this month, have to move. We'll follow ridgeline east toward what I think is Logging Road. Saw it from the ridgetop last week, maybe 10 miles. Have to try." After that, the pages were blank. The discovery reignited the case. Analysts determined the cave had been occupied intermittently over approximately 14 months, but no human remains were found in the surrounding area. Daniel had survived at least that long, alone, adapting to conditions that would have killed most people. The revelation was both a miracle and a deepening mystery. Why had the search teams missed this area? Investigators reviewed their original grid patterns and realized the cave system sat just beyond the expanded perimeter they had established after the first month. The decision to limit the search radius had been based on standard protocols. Most lost hikers either find their way back or succumb within a much smaller area. Daniel's injury had trapped him beyond the reach of systematic searching, and by the time he was mobile again, the active search had scaled down. But the larger question remained unanswered. If Daniel had left the cave heading east more than a decade ago, where was he now? Behavioral specialists suggested disorientation, head trauma, or a psychological break triggered by isolation. Some theorized he might have died shortly after leaving the cave, his remains scattered by animals in terrain that made recovery unlikely. Others proposed he had successfully reached civilization, but suffered from amnesia or traumatic dissociation that prevented him from identifying himself. Margaret refused to accept speculative diagnoses without evidence. She studied the notebook entries obsessively, cross-referencing them with topographic maps, and identified a pattern in his descriptions of terrain. He had been moving methodically eastward, following ridgelines and game trails, possibly believing he was navigating towards civilization, but instead penetrating further into the roadless expanse of the Gifford-Pinchot wilderness. Tom organized new search grids based on this trajectory, but the area was vast, broken by canyons and dense with old-growth forest, where a person could pass within 50 feet of another and never know. They found scattered evidence. A campfire ring that might have been Daniel's, initials carved into a tree trunk that matched his style, a torn piece of fabric snagged on branches that could have come from his jacket. Each discovery felt significant, but proved nothing. The forest had absorbed him, and unlike the cave that had preserved his story, the wilderness offered no clear narrative, only fragments that might mean everything or nothing. Years accumulated like sediment. The Kresses continued their vigil, their lives narrowing to a single focus. They established a small non-profit to fund extended searches for long-term missing persons in wilderness areas, partnering with volunteer search and rescue organizations and advocating for policy changes in how agencies approach cases that extended beyond the initial critical window. Margaret began speaking at conferences about the psychological endurance of the lost, about how survival instinct could keep someone alive long past expected limits, and about the need for search protocols that accounted for injured or disoriented victims who might travel unpredictable distances. The work gave structure to grief, transformed helplessness into action, but did not fill the absence at the center of their lives. Emily graduated high school, then college, her brother's disappearance shaping every major decision. She became a search and rescue coordinator, drawn to the profession by an absence she could not fill. She learned technical rope rescue, wilderness navigation, crisis psychology, and became one of the most requested coordinators in the Pacific Northwest. Her colleagues knew her story, but rarely mentioned it, understanding that her expertise had been purchased at a price no one should have to pay. She led searches for other people's missing loved ones with a fierce dedication that sometimes frightened her partners, pushing into terrain others deemed too dangerous, staying out longer than protocols recommended, driven by the knowledge that someone's sister was waiting. Someone's parents were mapping impossible routes on their walls. Someone's life had been suspended mid-breath by loss. The case faded from news cycles, but never from the family's waking hours. Daniel's room remained untouched, his belongings exactly as he had left them that October morning. Margaret dusted his books every week. Tom maintained his hiking boots, replacing laces that had dry rotted, as if preparing for his son to walk back through the door and complain they had let his gear deteriorate. The ritual was absurd and necessary, a way of keeping faith when faith had no rational foundation. Their friends worried they were trapped in a grief that would consume them, but the Kresses understood something their friends did not. You could not move on from an unfinished story. You could only move forward into it, following its threads wherever they led, no matter how many years it took. On the evening of March 19th, 2017, a man in his early 30s knocked on the door of the Kress cabin. It was raining, a cold spring downpour that turned the gravel drive to mud and obscured the forest in sheets of grey. Tom answered and found a stranger standing in the porch light, thin and bearded, wearing clothes that looked assembled from thrift stores and donation bins. The man's face was weathered, deeply lined for his apparent age, and his eyes held a strange mixture of recognition and uncertainty. His hair was long and unkempt, his hands calloused and scarred. He shifted his weight from foot to foot like someone who had forgotten the protocol for standing still, and when he spoke, his voice cracked from disuse. He said, "Dad, it's me." Tom staggered backward, his hand gripping the doorframe for support. Margaret appeared in the hallway, drawn by the sound of her husband's sudden intake of breath, and when she saw the man in the doorway, she made a sound that was not quite a scream, not quite a word, something primal that came from a place beyond language. The man who claimed to be Daniel stood motionless in the rain, as if he had forgotten how to enter a house and waited for permission to come home. For a long moment, no one moved. Rain drummed on the porch roof. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Then Margaret stepped forward slowly, her hand extended, and touched the man's face. He flinched, but did not pull away, and when her fingers traced the scar above his left eyebrow, the one he had gotten falling from a tree at age 7, she whispered his name and pulled him inside. The reunion was not cinematic. It was awkward, tentative, and profoundly disorienting for everyone involved. Daniel sat at the kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast 14 years earlier, now a man in a boy's chair, and could not immediately explain where he had been or why he had not returned sooner. He spoke in fragments, his narrative disjointed, as if language itself had become a skill he had partially unlearned. Tom made coffee with shaking hands. Margaret sat across from her son, unable to look away, terrified he would disappear if she blinked. They called Emily, who arrived 90 minutes later, and stood in the doorway staring at the brother she had last seen as a 16-year-old boy, now aged beyond his years, a stranger wearing her brother's scar. Over the following days, sitting at the kitchen table with his parents and a trauma counselor, Daniel began to reconstruct his story. The process was painful and slow, memories surfacing in pieces that did not always fit together chronologically. After leaving the cave system, he had continued east, surviving on foraged plants, small game trapped with improvised snares, and an iron determination not to die. He described learning which berries were safe through careful observation of what birds ate, how he had caught fish with his hands in shallow streams, how he had made fire using the magnifying lens from his broken camera. He had lost track of time completely, measuring his existence only by seasons. The winter, when snow buried the forest and he nearly froze in a hollow tree. The spring, when food became abundant and he regained strength. The summer, when he finally reached what he thought was a logging road. But reaching civilization had not meant rescue. By then, something had broken in him. He could not articulate what exactly, only that standing on that dirt road with traffic, sounds in the distance, he had felt overwhelming panic. The thought of explaining where he had been, of facing his parents' grief and the world's questions, of being Daniel Kress again, after becoming something else entirely, had paralyzed him. He had walked away from the road, back into the forest, and stayed there another week, trying to build courage that would not come. Eventually, hunger and thirst drove him to a small town whose name he could not remember, where he drank from a gas station bathroom faucet and stole food from behind a grocery store. A trucker offered him a ride, asked no questions, dropped him in Portland. He invented a name, found work washing dishes, slept in shelters and under bridges, and drifted through the margins of society where people did not ask about your past because they were hiding their own. He had known his parents were searching. He had seen his own missing poster in a gas station once and stood in front of it for 20 minutes, unable to reconcile the boy in the photograph with the man he had become. The boy looked impossibly young, impossibly innocent, someone from another life. He had walked away from that poster and kept walking through Oregon and Washington, working odd jobs that paid under the table, moving whenever someone looked at him too closely or asked too many questions. He built a life that was not really a life, existing in the spaces between official notice, and told himself it was better this way, that his family had mourned and moved on, that returning would only reopen wounds that had finally healed. Years passed in a blur. He worked on fishing boats, in warehouses, at lumber mills. He lived in his car when he had one, in tent encampments when he did not. He drank too much for a while, stopped when he recognized the pattern forming. He watched other people live normal lives from a distance, like someone looking through a window at a warm house, unable to remember how to knock on the door. The dissociation was complete. He was not Daniel anymore. He was not anyone. He was simply someone who moved through the world without leaving marks, without accumulating history, a ghost in his own story. What finally brought him back was not a single moment of clarity, but an accumulation of small fractures in his isolation. A librarian in a town whose name he could not remember had asked if he needed help finding anything, and her kindness, so simple and unearned, had undone something in him. He had looked up his family online at a public computer, discovered they were still in the area, still searching, and realized that his absence was a wound that would never close unless he chose to close it. He read about the non-profit his parents had founded, about Emily's work in search and rescue, and understood that his disappearance had not been a tragedy they had overcome, but the defining fact of their lives. The guilt was crushing and clarifying. He had survived the forest, but failed to survive being found. Now he had to choose whether to remain a ghost or to become human again. So he had walked, hitching rides when he could, until he reached the forest that had transformed him, and then he had walked the final miles to the only door he had ever been able to call home. Standing on the porch in the rain, he had almost turned back. But his father had opened the door, and there was no turning back from that moment, no returning to the safety of invisibility. He had knocked, and the knock had shattered 14 years of absence. And now he had to live with whatever came next. The world reacted with astonishment and skepticism. News outlets descended on the family, demanding details, questioning the plausibility of a 14-year survival, followed by voluntary obscurity. Investigative journalists traced Daniel's movements through employment records, shelter logs, and interviews with people who had encountered him in transient communities. Every detail checked out. Forensic analysis of his physical condition showed evidence consistent with prolonged malnutrition, environmental exposure, and injuries that had healed without medical care. A film crew located the cave system and documented the tally marks Daniel confirmed he had made, his handwriting verified by experts. Slowly, the public narrative shifted from disbelief to reluctant acceptance. Daniel Kress had survived, but survival had cost him more than a decade of life. He had become a ghost in his own story, and returning meant learning to be human again. Reintegration was neither swift nor simple. Daniel struggled with crowds, with noise, with the expectation that he could simply resume being the 16-year-old who had left for a sunrise photograph. He suffered from severe anxiety and dissociative episodes, moments where he could not distinguish past from present, where the kitchen table became a cave floor and his mother's voice became wind through trees. He required months of intensive therapy to begin processing the trauma of his isolation and the guilt of his years in hiding. The guilt was worse than the isolation had been. He had survived alone in the wilderness, but he had not been alone. His family had been searching, suffering, building their lives around his absence. His survival had been their torment, and he had prolonged it by choice. No amount of therapy could erase that knowledge. Margaret and Tom provided unwavering support, but the son who had returned was not the son they had lost, and all three had to grieve the boy who would never come back while learning to know the man who had. Margaret had imagined reunion 1,000 times, but never like this, never with a son who flinched at touch and could not sleep indoors. Tom had to relearn how to be a father to an adult who had raised himself in ways no parent could comprehend. They moved slowly, carefully, giving Daniel space while making clear he was not alone. They did not press for details he was not ready to share. They did not demand explanations for choices made in circumstances they could not imagine. They simply offered presence and waited for him to find his way back to them at his own pace. Emily found it hardest. She had built her entire adult life around her brother's absence, and his presence destabilized the identity she had forged in response to loss. Her work in search and rescue had been a way of finding him by proxy, of saving other people's brothers and sisters and sons. Now he was here, and she did not know how to be his sister again. They sat together in painful silence at first, unable to bridge 14 years with words. Eventually they began walking together in the forest, not talking, just moving through the space that had taken him and returned him changed. On these walks, Emily began to understand that her brother had not simply survived. He had become something else, someone who knew the forest in ways she never would, who moved through wilderness with a confidence that came from having conquered it. The knowledge was strange and sad, and somehow beautiful. Daniel began attending support groups for survivors of long-term trauma, sitting in circles with veterans and abuse survivors and others who had lived through experiences that separated them from ordinary life. He did not share much at first, but listening to others describe their struggles with reintegration helped him understand he was not uniquely broken. Everyone in the circle had survived something that had changed them fundamentally, and everyone was trying to figure out how to live in a world that expected them to simply move on. The shared understanding was more healing than individual therapy had been. He enrolled in a community college, studying ecology and wilderness management, fields that honored rather than rejected his experience. His professors quickly recognized that he had knowledge no textbook could provide, an intimate understanding of how humans adapt to wilderness, of the psychological challenges of extended isolation, of the line between survival and surrender. He wrote papers that became case studies, His thesis on long-term wilderness survival without equipment was published in a search and rescue journal and changed training protocols across multiple agencies. He started giving talks at search and rescue trainings, sharing insights about the mindset of the lost and the barriers that prevent people from seeking help even when help is near. He described the shame he had felt, the belief that he had failed by getting lost in the first place, the fear of judgment that had kept him hiding even after reaching civilization. His testimony led to changes in how search teams approach long-term missing persons cases, emphasizing the psychological complexity of survival and the need for outreach campaigns that address shame, fear, and identity confusion in potential survivors. He became an advocate for better mental health support for the found, arguing that rescue was only the beginning of a much longer journey back. The legal questions were settled quietly. Daniel had committed no crime except existing under false names for work. Misdemeanors, the district attorney declined to prosecute given the circumstances. There were complications with his social security number, with tax records, with establishing identity for someone who had been legally missing for 14 years, but attorneys worked through the bureaucratic tangles. The story, once a spectacle, gradually became a case study, a teaching tool, and finally a testament to the resilience of the human mind and the enduring gravity of family. On a cool morning in October 2018, 15 years after his disappearance, Daniel returned to the ridge overlook where his trail had ended. His parents came with him, along with Emily and a small group of rangers who had never stopped searching. They carried no cameras this time, no maps marked in red. They simply stood in the amber light, filtering through the canopy, and watched the sun break over the ridgeline, the forest patient and ancient below them. Daniel closed his eyes and, for the first time in 15 years, allowed himself to feel the forest not as a captor or a crucible, but as the place that had taught him against all odds how to survive. The mist clung low between the Douglas firs, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine resin, exactly as it had that October morning when a boy had walked into the trees and failed to return. But now he was standing here, no longer lost, no longer hiding, simply present in the place where his story had broken and begun again. Margaret took his hand. Tom rested a hand on his shoulder. Emily stood beside him, finally able to see her brother, not as the absence that had defined her life, but as the presence that would shape whatever came next. Then together they turned, and with the forest at their backs, they walked down the trail toward home, leaving the wilderness behind, but carrying its lessons forward, one deliberate step at a time, toward a future none of them could have imagined, but all of them had earned the right to build.